Well, first of all, thank you everybody for coming to this event. If you don't know who I am, I'm Mark Lissiardello, Chairman of the International Facility Management Association. And on behalf of our speakers that will be talking to us today about cities, I want to welcome all of you in the room today and all of you around the world that will view this landmark event. So welcome to IFMA's Rethink the City Symposium. We greatly appreciate and value your participation in this landmark event discussing sustainable growth and development of cities. Together, we can prepare for and assure facility management's involvement in planning, driving, and supporting cities of the future are at the table. When we first started talking about this idea, probably almost a year ago, it almost reminded me of our government relations program, and Jeff, were in the room, probably 10 or 12 years ago, where they were saying, what are FMs doing at the table with government relations? And now we have tremendous success in the US, in Europe, in Asia Pacific, in advancing the thought leadership of FM. So, smart cities, smart buildings. The concept of a smart city, even the term city of the future, may bring to mind images from some science fiction movies. For example, Blade Runner imagined a bleak future. Overpopulation and environmental deterioration forced the city dwellers at ground level to live under unlivable conditions. Probably a more optimistic, maybe, vision is the Jetsons cartoon, one of my old favorites. A techno-utopian city in the sky, with clean air, flying cars, jetpacks, robot maids, and moving sidewalks. Everything is automated, your heart's desire at the push of a button. Well, neither scenario in and of itself seems incredible reality, but it is possible to find ourselves somewhere in the middle. Cities around the planet already have real-world and real serious urban problems to basic lifeline systems and support. Scarce resources, overcrowding, crumbling infrastructure, decaying buildings, poverty, waste management, and transportation challenges threaten to create the uninhabitable city of the future. However, cities worldwide are also leading the way toward the utopian city of the future. A sustainable city that integrates community, environment, economics, and technology. One that has run through a central nervous center. A great example is what IBM is doing around the world. IBM currently has 2,000 intelligent operations center projects in cities around the world to monitor, measure, and manage city services. From crime prevention analytics in Portland, Oregon, to smarter public transport systems in China. IBM's flagship project is in Rio de Janeiro, where it's built a citywide operations center which connects all of the city's 30 agencies from transport to emergency services. Another example is Masdar City in Abu Dhabi. It's a planned city designed to be a hub for clean tech companies. Some of the things that they've done there, the city will be entirely on solar energy and other renewable energy sources with a zero carbon, zero waste ecology, starting with a blank slate. In addition to geothermal energy, wind farms will be established outside the city's perimeter that will generate approximately 20 megawatts. A solar-powered desalination plant will be used to provide the city's water needs, and biological waste will be used to create nutrient-rich soil and fertilizer. Pedestrian-friendly and entirely car-free, the city is experimenting with a network of electric, driverless pod cars. Another prediction from sci-fi realized. So almost, as you'll hear in much more detail than I'm going to talk about here, almost half of the world's population currently lives in cities. And by 2050, the number is projected to be somewhere around 75%. So for facility management, for community and just for people, for all the planners, for all the functional leaders in this environment, how do we prepare for this increasing populace? How do we support the rising needs of both resident and commercial buildings? How can we be sure that we're as smart as our smart cities? Part of why we're here today. Urban development presents yet another remarkable opportunity for our worldwide community of facility management professionals to share our thought leadership related to the built environment, to drive innovation and lead change for the benefit of our cities, our countries, and our world. Well, we have a lot planned for today, and so with that, it gives me very great pleasure to introduce IFMA Board Director and the Chair of the City Symposium Task Force, IFMA Fellow, Untitled.
Well, cities are a new field for IFMA, and I'd like to tell you a little bit how we're approaching this subject. There are 2 symposia that are planned this year. You're at one of the first one of these at Fusion. The second one's going to take place at World Workplace in October. The goals of today are really to cast a very wide net as to what cities are, various types of cities, what makes for a successful city, representing various points of view from our speakers, what's a regulated city, smart city, unregulated city, how are they evolving. So it's really an educational session to introduce us to the subject matter. There's also going to be some case studies. At the World Workplace component, it's going to be much more focused on IFMA and what's the nature of the bridge, the link that exists, if any, between cities and how they're evolving, and what IFMA is about. Our balanced scorecard, our various credentialing programs, our core competencies, and things like that. So we're here to learn today, and basically, if I can find a clicker, we're going to back forward. We're going to simply introduce the subject matter at Fusion, and there it is. The sessions this afternoon are going to be divided into 3 separate components. The first one is the background component. One of our speakers, the first speaker after the introduction that David is going to give, Sam is going to talk about his background as a mayor and governance of Vancouver, the role of density in cities. So we're going to deal with governance, cultural issues, and his concept of successful cities as he knows it. The next speaker is going to be Jeff, and Jeff is going to talk about this from a more physical, walkable city perspective. And the third speaker is David, who is an economist, among other things, and is going to represent a financial, economic perspective. What you'll see at the bottom is we're trying yet another experiment this afternoon, which is to get questions after each of these components that relate to feedback that we have from the audience and questions of the speaker. So Andrea Sanchez, who's the editor of our Facility Management Journal, is going to be collecting questions via Twitter and via email that you have in the audience. So if you would sort of copy down the addresses that you see on the screen, and please feel free to use your cell phones if you can. Somebody said that they were having trouble getting through with their cell phone. But there'll also be mics on the floor where you'll be able to ask questions as well. I might add that one of the other components besides just the task force and the advisory board is a focus group that we've put together who are charged with explicitly trying to define what the nature of that interface is between IFMA and cities. So they'll be not only asking questions and helping to define what the conference, the World Workplace Conference, is going to be about, but they're playing a very active role. And I'd like to invite anybody that's in the audience today that's interested in participating in this integration issue to just let me know, or anybody that's on the floor know, and we'll set up some kind of structure to make sure that you can participate in this, what we consider a really critical and important process. So that's component one. Component two is case studies, and for that we're going to be looking at cities from a different perspective. We're going to be looking at cities that are new, such as North Korea, some of the cities that Mark mentioned, India, China, what have you, some of the cities that are dying or shrinking, some of the cities that are being renovated and born again in the United States that are taking advantage of things like big data and growth, and those are going to compose the second component, the case study component of this. Once again, we're going to solicit questions through a variety of mechanisms to be able to ask questions of the speakers. There are breaks between these things. This does not go nonstop. After each component, there will be a break. There will be coffee and some, I guess, some food out after the first one as well. The third component that starts up at 5 o'clock, even though we got a late start, so I'll say 5:15, is going to relate to just a question and answer, an open format question and answer to take place with the audience. And at that point, we're going to try to attempt to take a first cut and see if we can identify some of those bridges that exist between IFMA and some of the content that you're going to hear about today. So with that, let me briefly introduce our speakers. Slightly distorted, but there they are. The first one is Dave Schleicher. He's going to act as moderator for this afternoon. David has degrees in law and economics, teaches at George Mason School of Law. Research involves land use issues, local government law, agglomeration, and perhaps you should explain that term at some point.
I will.
And zoning issues. Our second speaker is Mayor Sam Sullivan. Sam is a member of the Order of Canada, which is his country's largest civilian award. Served as mayor of Vancouver from 2006 to 7, adjunct professor, University of British Columbia, School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture. Mayor Sullivan's major policy platform is Eco-Density Initiative, which promoted the idea of urban densification. And I might add, he's also founder and CEO of the Global Civic Policy Society up in Vancouver. Jeff Speck is a city planner and urban designer. Advocates internationally for smart growth and sustainable design. Currently leads Speck & Associates, private consultancy offering design and advisory services to public officials and real estate industry. He was the director of design at the National Endowment of the Arts from 2003 to 7. Created a Governor's Institute of Community Design. His latest book, Walkable Cities, is an examination of how the architectural evolution of major cities has changed the lives of ordinary citizens in both a positive and negative way. This book will be available, and I guess, Jeff, if you're available to sign it, if people are interested in getting it.
Rumor has it there's a signing, but we'll see if they come.
Okay, well, it'll probably be there. They said it's going to be there. One other slide I'm going to leave on the screen a little bit longer. Oh, sorry. Can you go back one, please? Is the core competencies that exist. And I wanted to leave these here just because one of our goals is to try to make that link back to to IFMA between what you're going to be hearing today. So I thought that it might be useful just to list them, if nothing else, so that you can try to think about that and think about some of these connections as you hear the content that is the subject matter of the talks. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dave Schleicher, who will moderate the session today.
I'm really excited to be here, I think, for a couple reasons. One is because here with such a distinguished and great panel, people who are both doers and thinkers in the space of designing cities and thinking about cities. And the second is to be here with you. I hope that this event leads us to both be able to tell you some things about city development and kind of how cities are and should be developing, and also to learn a lot about how the kind of guardians of the built space of cities, kind of the buildings inside cities, can tell us about how we should think about city design. So I'm going to do a quick introduction on the issues that we're going to talk about before moving on to kind of the more substantive parts of the first session. So there we go. Oops, back one. So I know IFMA has been talking a lot about the role technology is playing in changing workplaces. And there's certainly a lot of discussion of the way information technology is changing cities. In fact, with every revolution in information technology in the 20th and 21st centuries, we heard about the death of cities. So we'd hear something like the telegraph or the telephone or the internet or video conferencing will lead to people moving out of cities. And the logic of these arguments, Toffler famously made this, others, is that property in cities is really expensive. An office building in Manhattan costs a lot of money. And if people can just telecommute, they can live in Idaho or the suburbs or wherever, and they don't need to be in cities. So why pay the rent if you don't have to? Who needs in-person communication when you can have video conferencing? This runs into a major problem, which is that it turns out it's not true. 100 years ago, 10% of the world's population lived in cities. 50 years ago, 30. Today, it's over 50. And by 2030, it'll be 60%, and growing constantly. And that you can see in this graphic, it's true across continents. In every continent, we've seen increases in urbanization. Kind of at the biggest numbers are in Asia, but it's true across the entire world. And we see really dramatic examples. So in China, we saw from 1990 to today, went from about 25% to 50% of the population lives in cities. Between today and 2025, 300 million people will move to cities. That's the population of the United States will be urbanizing in China. Throughout the developing world, we see cities of 20 million popping up. And we see people's desire to move to cities is so strong that we see the development of things we call mega slums. About 2 in 5 urban dwellers will live in areas with few public services. The desire to access the economies of cities is so strong that people are willing or forced to live in places without major public services, roads, and you can see a kind of characteristic example. Cities here are growing too, although it's not the narrative you usually hear. So rural population in the United States is at its lowest level in American history, and it's continuing to shrink. People from rural areas are moving to metropolitan areas, be they cities or suburbs. Further, in our biggest and richest cities, we've seen huge price increases. We'll talk a lot today about why these huge price increases have not related in population flows, but the quick story is that people do want to live in cities. We see the same thing about demand for office space and among millennials. So demand for office space, I put up some characteristic statistics from DC, the DC region, but office demand has been increasing in cities relative to suburban office demand. Further, when you talk to millennials kind of defined as people 18 to 34, population I'm sadly no longer a part of, we see that 88% of them say they want to live in a downtown setting. That's survey data, but it's suggestive of the fact that there's an increasing demand for urban life. Why? Why do people want to live in cities now more than ever? Well, so the first question we could ask is where we started, with questions about technology. People think of information technology as playing as a substitute for in-person contact. We will video conference instead of meeting in person. And that certainly happens sometimes. You can see people meeting over their computers instead of actually having coffee. But information technology plays other roles. For instance, it's a complement to in-person contact. So I'm sure most of you heard about this event by email. Information technology was allowing or setting up for an in-person contact. Further, it has what what economists would call an income effect on our social life. People who use Facebook keep in touch with way more people. They then meet those people when they're around, they meet with them. So information technology isn't necessarily or mainly substituting for in-person contact that we get in cities, but it's increasing it. It's both complementing and increasing the number of people with whom we communicate. Further, there have been major changes in transportation costs that have affected the form cities take. So traditionally, and I'll talk about this a lot more later, that cities were places for manufacturing firms to locate near one another to reduce the shipping costs of goods. However, over the course of the 20th century, due to innovations like the combustion engine, the shipping container, the cost of shipping goods across the country has fallen to what one economist calls a rounding error. However, this has led to the decline of cities that kind of specialize in manufacturing: Detroit, Baltimore, Cleveland. However, the opportunity cost of transporting high-wage people has increased. So as wages have increased, and particularly as we've seen income inequality, the cost of getting people around, the opportunity cost, the time they spend commuting or flying when they could otherwise be working, has increased, and this has led to information workers locating in cities. Many of you have probably heard of Richard Florida's theory of the creative class. Well, one kind of structural story about why that would be the case is that the cost of transporting high-income workers has increased. Further, things about the economy, and we'll talk about this, may have increased the value of high-income people talking to one another, or the benefits of information spillovers from knowledge workers. Finally, we've seen major changes in prices in urban form. So it's a long-running story in American life that governmental policies have been kind of promoting suburbs. But until the 1970s, and promoting kind of high housing prices in some suburbs, until the 1970s, though, we didn't see any region-wide increases in housing prices. That on a region-wide level, the cost of housing was roughly equal to the cost of constructing housing. Since the 1970s, in major coastal areas, first in California and then on the East Coast, we've seen a huge increase in housing prices relative to construction costs in a number of metropolitan areas. This has had really dramatic effects on who lives where. So until roughly this period, average state GDPs were moving closer. So each year, the average GDP of Alabama and Mississippi, the poorest states, was getting closer to the average GDP of Connecticut, the richest state, and New Jersey. Starting in the 18s, this convergence slows, and then today it's basically stopped. And the question is why? Well, one thing we've seen is that government policies have restricted entrance or restricted building in our richest areas. And so if you look on the right of this graph, it's the average housing value in San Jose. Silicon Valley is kind of our richest and fastest growing kind of iconic modern industry town. But it turns out during the 1990s, late 1990s and 2000, Silicon Valley loses population. It loses overall population 1995 to 2000 and loses domestic population 2000 to 2010. It's slightly offset by immigration. And why is this the case? Well, it's because the cost of housing is increasing faster than wages are increasing. And if you think about how fast wages are increasing in Silicon Valley, that's a really amazing fact. Turns out in the San Francisco region and soon in a bunch of other ones, about half the cost of every building is due to supply constraints. We can talk about how we could develop that number, but it's a really striking fact. The final thing that I want to talk about that will lead nicely into our discussions is that there's been a revolution in thinking about cities. There have been revolutions in thinking about the economics of cities, which I'm going to talk about. There's been revolutions in thinking about crime. There have been revolutions in things about transportation, and revolutions in thought about city planning, which Jeff will talk about. Further, as Mark noted, there have been huge increases in the information available for research. So I have a graphic there of IBM's Smart City program, but there are also these major university programs at NYU and MIT that are using, kind of getting big data sets from the use of sensors and other kind of newfangled fancy stuff to gather enormous data sets that can gather how people actually use information about how people actually use cities. So we're on the cusp of a real changes in how we think about cities, which is why I think it's kind of a wonderful time to be holding this event. So I'm going to turn the mic over to Sam, and he's going to talk to us about eco-density. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I want to, first of all, just acknowledge the IFMA and Eric Teichholz for putting this on. As a mayor, as a civic politician, I've often thought we should be going the other way. We should be having IFMA telling us about how to run a city versus politicians telling you how to run facilities. I have been very struck by how some of the most important roles in our community, parenting, politicians, there's no criteria, there's no credentials you need to do either of them. And these are so important, and yet for me as a mayor, all I need to do is get onto a party ticket and get enough X's beside my name. And that somehow gives me the credibility and competence to run a city. So as a municipal politician, I got involved in trying to understand what it is my job is about. What am I trying to do? And, you know, what kind of a city do we want? There are many things to think about. Defense. Cities have often been created around defense, how to stop people from getting massacred by neighboring tribes. Consumption, that's a very important element right now. We're creating cities, you know, powerful, successful cities are cities that create high quality consumption for workers that are coveted around the world. We have, production has often been a very important element. We want to be near the coal mine or near the port. Environment is becoming much, much more important, and political strategy, that national political strategy can sometimes affect those things. So I looked at a number of different variables, and certainly the environment is becoming far more important than it ever was. And I looked at some of the data, and here's a graph that compares energy use with densification. And as you can see, it's a very nice line. It really tracks very well how much density. So you can increase even slightly your density from a small, when your densities are quite low, and you will dramatically decrease your energy use. There's a bit of a sweet spot where most of the European cities are, and after that you don't actually get the same benefits per capita, but certainly a city like Hong Kong has huge benefits by having such high density. Now in Vancouver, we looked at the GHGs that are contributed by both transportation and living. And we see that those people who live in the downtown create about 1.5 tons of greenhouse gas per year. In the next, the orange level circling it, you'll get up to 3 tons. It's twice as much. And in the gray area, you're up to 6 tons. There was recently, once you get past the river and you get beyond, you're up to 8 tons. And we don't have much better data right now for some of the furthest suburbs. But I know that the World Bank did a study on Toronto, and they found in the downtown of Toronto it's 1.3 tons per person, and in the farthest suburb near Whitby, it's 13 tons. So 10 times as much greenhouse gas based on where you live. Very profound. The two really important issues around for environmentalists seem to be climate change and habitat loss. Now, we look at different forms of living, and you can see 35 blocks of 33 feet lots. That's fairly dense for some, certainly for suburbs, and yet it's 35 blocks will be taken what you could do in 1 block. And on a moderate density, you will have 3 blocks, so still 3 times as much. Clearly, for the environment, density is great. Now, when I became mayor, I tried to find environmental groups that were based on urban issues. And almost all the environmental groups I found were all about the wilderness. And yet, it's not, you know, it's the consumption and the production of cities that are far more important for the environment. And yet, very few groups. I did find one, and I went off to Ottawa to meet with them to find out how I could sign up and how we could get our city involved in being better for the environment. And I went through the list, the checklist, and I got through the end of it. I said, where's density? Well, we wanted to put it in, but it was too controversial. I said, if you're the advocacy groups and it's too controversial for you, what am I doing as a politician talking about it? And I had been told by a senior civic official do not mention the D word. It is a good way to end your political career. And I realized, yeah, there are two things that our citizens in Vancouver do not like. One is sprawl, and the other is density. So this put me in a very tough situation. So what do I do? And I looked at other things. Here's a graph on urbanization and income. So it seems like the more a country will urbanize, the more likely it is to have higher income. Looked at other issues. For example, density and gross metropolitan product. So if you increase the density of a city, not the size of a city, but the density of a city by about 50%, you get about a 4% increase in gross metropolitan product. Then studies on well-being and urbanization. People actually have higher satisfaction in life the more they urbanize. This is something that I was working on with, because there's a lot of pressure to not go high and to just have lower height. This is what developers say. It's, of course, dependent on a lot of variables, but generally, as you start going up in height, you actually get a declining return on investment until, when at the point where you have to go to concrete and elevators and things, and then after a certain level, you start to get oxygen again. And height is actually good in terms of what we do in Vancouver, which is we learn to extract from developers value. That if rezoning will give a lot more value to a developer, we are able to negotiate through discretionary zoning and through incentives more public benefits. Another interesting phenomenon is that as you rise in density, you start to get a decrease, you get an increase in transit, and then you start to lose transit ridership. And what happens is people now start to walk once you get very high densities. So I also was very interested in the arguments against densification, and there was a thesis written by a person in Frankfurt who was a master's in urban planning and architecture. They wrote against density, especially against the high-rise tower. And the concept for this gentleman was that high-rise living actually degrades traditional culture. And in his case, it was Muslim culture. And it is interesting that in Vancouver, where you will find the most tolerance and diversity and inclusiveness in societies, it's in the highest density places. Now, certainly in Vancouver, for example, stores and operations that are friendly to gay people, you will only find in the highest density places and not in the suburbs. And the person who wrote this thesis against the high-rise tower was Mohammed Atta, who drove the plane into the World Trade Tower. I have not yet been able to get a copy of this thesis. Apparently no one can. But I believe there would be some very interesting insights into the mindset. Now, we always think about the ideology that destroyed the World Trade Towers. We thought of it as the Taliban. It's actually found in European universities, and which is anti-tower. We have an architectural critic in Vancouver has called 9/11 the most extreme form of architectural criticism that we have seen. We also find that in cities, and especially high-density cities, the greatest cultural achievements. This is the Museum of Anthropology in Vancouver. And in Vancouver, we have in our downtown area on the Burrard Peninsula, surrounded by ocean and mountains, etc., we have developed a very high-density community where walking is by far the main mode of transportation. I have been, in my life, a very big fan of Jane Jacobs, and here I was, one of the highlights of my life was to be able to sit on her porch with her on 67 Albany Street talking about porches. I was in heaven. And however, after I returned to Vancouver and I thought about it a bit more, I Google mapped it and I thought, there is a lot of, her neighborhood is right beside the high density areas of Toronto. And if we did not have, if her neighborhood had been allowed to densify as the market was demanding, would we have had Mississauga and the great swaths of suburbs that surround Toronto? I believe that, as a mayor, my question has been, density is good, so do we densify a little a lot or a lot a little? And this relates to my point about political strategy. I actually don't believe any strategy that says we have to densify a little a lot, or a lot a little will actually succeed. To ask large areas of a city to densify a little is politically impossible. Very, very difficult. But to about density, a lot about the way we approach cities. The concept of place is, I think, changing. What it may seem like the same place over time, but because of technology and communication, I think even the idea of place is changing. And I believe that we need to look at densification. It has now become a moral imperative that we densify, and we have to find ways to do it. And I'll be talking about that phase of it in the next presentation. Thank you.
But I am grateful to IFMA, which I thought was IFMA, but now I know is IFMA. And Eric, to you, and for you all for bringing me here today. This is an unusual kind of audience for me, but it's a different audience for me, which is good. I still, even after spending an hour on the phone discussing with Eric and his colleagues what you guys do, I still don't really understand it exactly. But I found that audiences, particularly audiences who have a particular focus that isn't mine, are very good at taking the stuff that I have to say about what I understand and applying it to what they do every day. So I'm confident you have the capacity to do that. But here's how I think what I'm going to talk about works for you. One of the things that was mentioned in our phone conversations was that in part of the work that some of you do, perhaps, you are making decisions about where to locate facilities, and that you have certain criteria that help you determine those locations, and that at least up till this point, ending right now, by the way, walkability has not been a factor in that decision-making process. Secondarily, a lot of you are managing or responsible for facilities in places, and those facilities can't be moved, despite perhaps the visions of the Jetsons or others. So you're stuck with what you've got. Then the question is, how can we make the places around those facilities more walkable, to make those facilities more successful for the reasons I'm going to be describing in response to question one. My second talk today will be about the how, will be about what you can do with what you've got. But my first brief talk today is about the compulsion, I think, that you as an organization should feel towards prioritizing the location of your facilities in more urban, and I should say more walkable places. A couple numbers that were brought up by the other speakers I want to dwell on myself. One is the 88% of millennials, it's college-educated millennials, who say they want to work in, who say that they want to live in America's urban cores. The other factor is that 64% of millennials college-educated millennials, decide first where they want to live, then move there, and then look for a job, which is very different from my generation. And most of the places I work, I am brought in by organizations who ask me, how do we attract more millennials? Often it's the town fathers who simply say, how can we get our kids to stay here? How can we get our grandkids to stay here? But they understand that millennials are engines of entrepreneurship who they want in their communities, and they didn't realize how important urbanity is to them. The other statistic that was brought up, or statistical correlation that was brought up, is that wonderful swooping vehicle miles traveled or gasoline consumption curve, which makes it very clear, I think as the mayor suggested, it makes it very clear that not only the denser you are, the lighter footprint you have, but it's a really, really sharp swoop. And actually, by moving from a place where it's 2 units per acre to 20 units per acre, and by the way, 20 units per acre is a perfectly comfortable, even American, like not North American, but American density of row houses, apartments, and even some single-family houses. Moving from 2 to 20 has as much of an impact on your contribution as moving from 20 to 200, moving all the way to Hong Kong. So even though we may not be there yet, we can accomplish very much by simply making the decision to live in more traditionally dense places. So there's an ecological imperative. So getting back to why you should care about this. Clearly in the goals that you lay out for yourselves as an organization, you wish to be more sustainable. I don't doubt that you've been endorsing LEED buildings for some time, and whether or not you feel it in your day-to-day, cost-benefit analysis, I'm sure that, like most Americans in business now, this is a criteria that you share. I know you're also interested in employee retention, employee health, and keeping employee health care costs low. And I want to talk about that a little bit as well. And of course, as suggested, you care tremendously about economic competitiveness. Now, it so happens that these three criteria, let me back up a bit. So I'm a city planner. I've been fighting for what turns out to be walkability for my whole career. We didn't call it that at first. We called it neo-traditional urbanism, which turned off the liberals. And then we called it the new urbanism, which turned off the conservatives. But it turns out that all we were talking about in talking about good urbanism was talking about density, or I should say talking about walkability. And, this was something we approached from an aesthetic perspective. We hated the way that sprawl made us feel. We didn't like the way it looked. People don't listen to that so much. Then there were sociologists who started talking about it from a sociologist's perspective, like Robert Putnam, who wrote Bowling Alone about around 1999, I think, talking about how actually people's participation in society correlated inversely with how much they were commuting, and that if you lived in the suburbs, every 10 minutes you added to your commute made you 10% less likely to participate in local activities. So there were the designers, the aesthetes, the sociologists arguing about why walkable, dense urban places were better, and we were essentially shouting into the wind because no one listens to us. And then about 15 years ago, this started to change because three groups, the economists, the epidemiologists, and the environmentalists, who at least more recently, the environmentalists, took a while for the environmentalists to get around the table, but since the impact of Silent Spring, they've been there. And these three groups started making their own arguments, each independently, for why walkable cities were so much healthier for us economically, physically, and environmentally. I want to talk about each of those very briefly. And by the way, you don't need to take notes if my book shows up, because it's all in there. Millennials want to be in cities. It's clear. They want the lifestyle of not having to drive. In the 70s, 1 out of 12 19-year-olds opted out of getting a driver's license. Now 1 out of 4 19-year-olds opt out of getting a driver's license. As the economist Chris Lineberger says, they grew up watching Friends, Seinfeld, Sex and the City, which is a marked distinction from my generation. I grew up watching Gilligan's Island, The Brady Bunch, Partridge Family. Gilligan's Island didn't have much to say about urbanism, but the other two, very suburban, very complacent. So this is a generation that was raised on admiring and wanting to live in cities. There's another demographic, of course, considerably larger, that's also changing cities and also is being drawn to walkable cities, which are the empty nesters, the parents of the millennials. 1.5 million people now are turning 65 every year. That's 4 times what it was a decade ago. They don't have the kids at home anymore. They don't care about the quality of the schools. They don't need the big yard. They don't want to heat and cool the house. And like my parents, who just moved from leafy Belmont Hill, Massachusetts to Lexington Center, Massachusetts, they want to be able to age in place and not have to re-retire to the nursing home, once they lose their viability by losing the capacity to drive, which in most of suburbia, of course, is the case. When you stop driving, you stop being self-reliant. So these two demographics are making cities much more desired within America, and while you've seen out-migration from cities in the U.S., and this is why I love the little a lot versus a lot a little, you've seen out-migration from cities in the U.S. generally, from many cities, from the 2000 to the 2010 census, but all downtown urban cores have been gaining population. Even in beleaguered Detroit, people want to be right in the heart of the downtown. And we know this by looking at Walk Score. Raise your hand if you know what Walk Score is. So Walk Score is this website, you can go to it right now, although don't because I'm talking, that rates every neighborhood, every address in America, and I think soon the world, by its access to daily needs, and essentially tells you how walkable your neighborhood is. And since it's been around for over a decade now, a lot of economists have been doing studies correlating walk scores with housing values. And it's worth, depending on where you are, but in a typical city like Charlotte, it's worth $2,000 a point in house value, and that's across a 100-point scale. So you can see that people are voting with their feet. So there's all sorts of, it's very clear what the demand is on the economic side. But there's another side of the argument, which is the costs, not the benefits of living in urbanism, but the costs to you, to your people who work in your buildings, of living in sprawl. And the city that demonstrates that the best in the US, although I imagine Vancouver demonstrates it better in North America, is Portland, Oregon. And Portland, Oregon, like Vancouver, in fact, not to the same degree, but made a whole bunch of decisions in the 70s about how they were going to grow that have profoundly impacted the lives of people in Vancouver, in Portland. I don't know if Portland impacted Vancouver, probably not. First of all, most American cities were just sprawling unconditionally. They decided to sprawl within an urban growth boundary that limited that. Second, while most American cities were building highways, they invested in biking and transit to a great degree. They spent about $60 million in biking over 25 years, which at half the cost of a clover leaf isn't all that much, but it changed them from biking just like everyone else to biking 15 times as much as the rest of America. And then while other cities were just reaming out their streets, look out the window here and see all the parallel parking that's been removed and all the additional lanes that have been added, they instituted a Skinny Streets program. And these efforts and others like them have caused Portland in the intervening years to grow differently from most American cities, so that Portland's vehicle miles traveled actually peaked in 1996, and they've been driving less every year since then, to the degree that they're now driving about 20% less than your typical American. And according to the economist Joe Courtwright, that 20% calculates to 4 miles a day, 11 minutes a day, and those two things together in terms of the cost of driving, which, by the way, 85% of which you send out of the economy when you pay for driving, and the cost of time, those 11 minutes, is fully 3.5% of their GDP. So where does that money get spent instead? Well, Portlanders are reputed to have the most roof racks per capita, the most independent bookstores per capita, the most strip clubs per capita. These are all slight exaggerations, but they consume recreation much higher than most other cities. But most of it's spent in their houses. And of course, housing is about the biggest, the most local investment that you can make. But there's another factor, just how people are living or what they're spending their money on is, as suggested by the other speakers, young, educated people are moving to Portland in droves. So that from 1990 to 2000, the number of college-educated 25 to 35-year-olds went up 50% in Portland, which is 5 times the national average. And I know you're getting ready to show me a number.
No, we're good.
Okay, I've got some time left. And so, people are attracted, young educated people are attracted to the sort of environment that you create when you do this. That's part of an economic argument that we could have for a much longer time. In terms of health, the best day to be a planner in America was August 9th, 2004, when two doctors and a planner, Frumpkin Frank and Dick Jackson, came out with a book called Urban Sprawl and Public Health that showed us in no uncertain terms how suburbanization was killing us and how actually people were living shorter lives because of the way that we were developing our country. Most of it's due to obesity. We now have a situation where gout has come back as a disease. Diabetes is getting bigger and bigger every year. 2% of Americans are now diabetic. 7% of Americans are now diabetic, consumes 2% of GDP. 1/3 of the kids born after the year 2000 are expected to become diabetic. Part of it's due to diet, no doubt, and the American corn syrup-based diet is certainly an issue, but people are starting to discover now how inactivity is a much more significant factor that correlates more directly with weight gain than diet does. And if you look at the American landscape and how it was in 1970 when half the American kids walked to school, as did I, with now when only 15% of kids walk to school, we've actually designed out of existence the useful walk in most of our communities. So the studies are very clear. They look, for example, in San Diego, they rank a bunch of neighborhoods as high walkable and a bunch of neighborhoods as low walkable, and then they investigate and they find that you're 35% likely to be overweight in the high walkable neighborhood and 65% likely to be overweight in the low walkable neighborhood. They find that every 5 minutes you add to your commute adds 3% to the likelihood that you'll be obese. They find, study after study, but it's very clear, and these studies zero out age and income and the other things that correlate with body mass. It's very clear that the way we design our places, or the kind of places we live in, have a huge factor on our health, so have a huge impact on our health. So if you want your employees, or you want the employees in your buildings to have fewer sick days, and by the way, the correlation with obesity and sick days is huge. So if you want healthier employees, locating facilities in walkable areas has a tremendous impact. Not even to mention car crashes. Car crashes kill 14 out of 100,000 Americans every year. We used to be as good as the rest of the world. There was a period there where we were one of the safest countries in the world to drive in. So we kill 14 a year per 100,000. Germany, with its no speed limit Autobahn, kills 7 a year. The UK kills 5. 3 is New York City. In fact, New York City has saved more lives since September 11th, speaking of that day, than were lost on September 11th. And in fact, there were a couple hundred collateral September 11th deaths that caused from people driving home instead of flying home when air traffic was limited after that event. But it's very clear. So it is, and why are people driving so much safer in Manhattan? Well, they're driving less, they're taking transit more, they're walking more, but actually they're driving safer. And the way that communities are designed has a huge impact on that, such that communities that were designed before the car was king are much safer to live in. So every mile driven in South Dakota is 3 times as likely to kill you as a mile driven in Massachusetts. And it goes on and on. And there's an asthma epidemic that's 3 times the deaths of asthma that we had back in the 90s. We have 3 times as many now. And it's all coming from car exhaust, and it's mostly located near big roads and highways. So huge health factor. And then finally is the environmental discussion. And as Mayor Sam suggested, the history of the environmental movement in the US, at least, perhaps in Canada as well, has been a pro-rural movement and not a pro-city movement. And for us it goes back as far as Jefferson, who said, cities are pestilential to the health, to the liberties, to the morals of man. If we continue to pile upon ourselves in cities as they do in Europe, we shall become as corrupt as they are in Europe and take to eating one another as they do there. I guess he had a sense of humor. But that's the history of the environmentalism movement in America, which really kind of, I'm seeing, if you believe that Green Metropolis is an environmental book, a great book by David Owen, or you read Ed Glazer and Triumph of the City, that the attitudes have really turned on a dime. And I think one of the most important factors there was the graph or the chart that the mayor showed. It used to be that when you looked at carbon maps of the country, it was like the night sky satellite imagery of the country, hottest around the cities, coolest in the countryside. But by changing from measuring, around 2001, Scott Bernstein at the Center for Neighborhood Technology said, is it really right to measure per square mile? No, it's much more useful to measure per person. So he looked at it per household rather than per square mile, and the maps all just flipped. So that led to people like Ed Glazer saying, we're a destructive species. The best thing you can do if you love nature is to stay away from it. And the denser the city, the better. And we're seeing now, as was suggested, New York City consumes gasoline at a rate that the rest of the country hasn't seen since the 20s. And New York, Toronto does twice as good as that. I'm sure Vancouver does as well. And Europe does twice as good as that, and Hong Kong does twice as good as that. And I like to joke that if 10 Hong Kongers wanted to move to New York and keep their gasoline consumption the same, 9 of them would have to stay home all day. The point is, we do have a long way to go, but we can get there quickly with small areas of truly increased density. And that leads finally to another thing the mayor mentioned, which was this quality of life ranking, or where do people consider the quality of life the highest? And we have this Mercer survey that ranks countries in 10 categories, governance, education, environment, climate, transportation, all the things that add up, very objective assessment, things that add up to the good life. And what's amazing, if you look at that ranking, it's usually won by, Dusseldorf or a lot of places where they speak German. Vancouver always does well. Vancouver won the Economist ranking, which is very similar. It uses Mercer data. It just is a little more Anglophile, I think, than the others. But you look at that ranking, no American city ever ranks above, say, 28, which is Honolulu. And then you see New York and Boston, Washington, Seattle, a number of others. They're all super walkable cities. There's no walkable city in the top 50. And what you find is a tremendous correlation between sustainability and between quality of life. And it isn't that being more sustainable makes our quality of life better. Is that the same thing that makes us sustainable is what makes our quality of life better. And that's living in a walkable community. In so many ways, I don't think we've even begun to figure it out yet. But in terms of the environmental discussion and the other two factors, if we are destroying the environment because we're spending so much of our time and our money and our health on the road, it would seem that those two different things share the same solution, which is to make our cities more walkable. In the short term, just move to a more walkable city. But in the long term, to make our cities more walkable addresses both those issues at the same time. And a lot of cities are doing that now, some more than others. I'm going to talk about that more in the second half, about what is being done. But it's certainly something that I think should be on your radar. And I'll end with just one other thought, which is that I was on the, just about how people think about, particularly sustainability. I was on the task force of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security Sustainability Task Force. I'm not saying this to brag, I'm just saying this about how bad things are. That if I had not been on that task force, it would have been entirely about two things: building design and vehicle design. Not a single person was bringing to the table how we choose to locate our facilities. That's what it was. And I got them to include in our report, which is now the rule, when it comes time to locate a facility, and all else being equal in terms of security, risks, and all those things, put it in a walkable part of a transit-served city. And not only will the footprint of the facility itself be less, but the footprint of the lives of all the people who work in it will be dramatically less. And I think that's an aspect of the discussion that is so often forgotten as we just buy more products to make ourselves more sustainable. So thank you for your attention. I look forward to talking to you more later.